Right. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Policy Research, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this book discussion on a book published by the World Bank and edited by Dr. Sanjay Kathuria, Senior Visiting Fellow, in fact, the latest faculty member to join the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. We are also privileged to have for this session a very distinguished set of panelists. Ambassador Shyam, Saran, former Foreign Secretary, and I will be introducing him later, but also Dr. Nagesh Kumar, who is head of South and Southwest Asia at the UNESCAP, and Dr. Selim Raihan, professor of economics at the Dhaka University. I am Gautam Mukhopadhaya. I'm also a former ambassador and also presently a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research. Dr. Kathuria's book is essentially a book on the prospects of trade, the gap between reality and potential in trade in South Asia. And it's a book that has been conducted with case studies and research over a period of time with almost all the neighbors in one form or the other. In some cases, analysis, in some cases, on the ground research. Dr. Kathuria himself is, I would like to introduce him. Not only has he been the lead economist and coordinator of South Asian regional integration at the World Bank, until 2012, he was also the bank's lead economist for Bangladesh based in Dhaka. And in the 26 years at the World Bank, he has worked in South Asia as well as in Latin America and East European regions. Prior to joining the World Bank, he was a fellow at ICRIA, New Delhi. So the format that we'll be following is, we'll be inviting Dr. Kathuria to first make a presentation on this book, which he has edited, but in which there have been many impressive contributions by a number of other scholars and policymakers. After that, we will be inviting each of the distinguished panelists, Dr. Nagesh Kumar, Professor Selim Raihan, and Ambassador Shyam Saran, to make their comments on the book, following which I will lead a discussion based on the book. I will introduce the panelists so that I don't speak too much right in the beginning. I will introduce the panelists once Dr. Kathuria has made his initial presentation. I regret, actually, Dr. Yamini Iyer would have liked to be here herself to present, and I think she's very proud to have Dr. Kathuria as a member of the faculty of the CPR, and she would have very much liked to have presented Dr. Kathuria herself, but in her absence, the honor falls on me, and I would then take this opportunity to invite Dr. Kathuria to make his presentation on this book, on the reality and potential of trade in South Asia and the obstacles that we find. I think he will be speaking with a presentation for about 25 minutes, after which we will proceed on to the panel discussion. Dr. Kathuria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, for the welcome. And I'm also delighted to have joined the faculty of CPR. And amongst old friends, Dr. Selim Raihan, Dr. Nagesh Kumar, Ambassador Saran, it's great to be back with you on this kind of floor. So as you said, Gautam, this is the World Bank venture is always the reason why a work like this gets a lot of traction, and this did get a lot of traction, is that it's a very large team that we assemble, we work together, we do a lot of collaboration. So I would just want to upfront acknowledge the core team, which included Priya Mathur, Nadeem Rizwan. And then it had collaborators from across the region, CUTS, Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka, Probir from RIS, Nisha from ICRIA, and then my other colleagues, Sohib Shahid, Mohini Dutt, and then I had, we worked together with Nikita Singla and Adnan Siddiqui, and then Grace James. So, and then, for the surveys, we worked with Sauti in Nepal, Brief in India, and PRI in Bangladesh. So again, huge team, and, we're bringing this together, and that's, I think that's part of the reason we did what we managed to do what we did. We brought out a lot of new data in the report, but obviously I will be wanting to go beyond the report and reflect a lot reflect a bit on what's happening currently in the region and the world. And obviously the presentation will skim the surface, go through the highlights, but there'll be a lot more in the report which you can download freely on the World Bank web. Okay, so let me get to it. So we all know that trade is always, is becoming, especially now it's becoming sort of normal in the world as the first victim of political tensions. After the Pulwama incident in 2019, India withdrew MFN status to Pakistan. And then in August 2019, there was a tit for tat after Jammu and Kashmir reorganization bill. Pakistan suspended bilateral trade with India. So the question which some might ask is, does the South Asia premise remain relevant in the light of this de facto trade ban between India and Pakistan? And my submission to you is that the trade continues to be important to lift up lives, and we know that examples of China, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, where it has been critical for removing people from poverty. And the fact that more barriers are being erected today means that more loss of opportunities to improve the lives of people. And actually more than ever, I would submit more than ever, given negative growth rates, countries can really ill afford to ignore the efficiencies that come from trade. So therefore, the short answer is South Asia premise remains very relevant. And the question is how to create openings, including in India-Pakistan trade. Now, this analysis, of course, was done over 2 years pre-COVID, but it remains very relevant today, as the presentation will show. So I want to start by taking you through an imaginary process of one South Asia, which wasn't actually imaginary in terms of connectivity even a few centuries ago. A South Asia, as Dr. Manmohan Singh had said famously, where you can breakfast in Kabul, lunch in Lahore, and I added tea in Delhi and dinner in Dhaka. So, a connectivity, it's enabled by frequent connections like you have in ASEAN. But the most fundamental reason to trade is consumers, right? And there's a video which I wanted to show you, but I think technology is challenging right now for that to happen. But it's from Multan and famous Pakistani broadcaster Sana Amjad, and I quote, she says, post the trade, de facto trade ban with India in Pakistan, it says, "Tamatar ki कीमत आसमान से बातें कर रही हैं," quote unquote. It means that the prices of tomatoes are touching the skies. Similarly, in India, dry dates prices after the imposition of duty by India, 200% duty imposition by India on Pakistani imports, dry dates prices increased by 300%, and a bag of cement rose from 275 rupees to 375 rupees. And this is research done by Afaq Hussain and Nikita Singla of Brief in 2020 in their new book of Unilateral Decisions, Bilateral Losses. And all of this is merely scratching the surface. So consumers are very important. So this is an unfortunate story of South Asia, very dynamic region of the world, and I dare say it will come back post-COVID to becoming one of the most dynamic regions of the world. But it grows very, very fast, but unfortunately also remains one of the most disconnected regions of the world, where the intra-regional trade as a share of regional GDP is less than 1% in South Asia, compared to even sub-Saharan Africa or even Middle East and North Africa, which are more than twice as high. Not to mention Latin America or East Asia, which is way higher. So what's the missing potential of South Asia? Now we know globally, if you think of all the prosperous regions of the world, what do you have in mind? You first and foremost think of European Union, East Asia, North America, and what's the common characteristic? Neighbors, trade and prosper. They engage economically with each other. Unfortunately, that's not the case in South Asia, and I just mentioned that. Potential trade in South Asia is is 3 times as the level it is currently, and this is based on 2015 data. But this could be, and obviously the gap keeps growing simply because the region is growing so fast, and the actual trade is, and this is based on gravity equations. So the actual trade is 1/3 of predicted trade. So that's very unfortunate because that's the lost opportunity. Similarly, and there's an intimate connection, as economists know, between foreign investment and trade, especially after the growth of global value chains. And again, the story here is perhaps even more dismal than on trade, where intra-regional investment is only 1% of South Asia's total, and less than, actually far below 1% of total outward investment from South Asia to the rest of the world. So let's talk a little about the barriers to trade and more broadly global engagement or economic engagement. Everybody has their favorite reasons, but but we will focus on a few, as I will just come to. But I want to mention the underlying theme in all of these obstacles is the lack of mutual trust, and this is a theme that we took up in the report, as I will just come to. So something new that we came up in the report is that South Asian countries don't actually discriminate against each other, despite the so-called South Asia Free Trade Agreement. They actually discriminate against each other. In other words, and we found this index of overall trade restrictiveness, that the barriers, apart from Afghanistan, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Pakistan, the countries for which we had the data, they impose greater barriers on imports from South Asia than on imports from the rest of the world. So in India, it was almost 10 times, 3 times for Sri Lanka, almost twice as high for Nepal, and 6 times as high for barriers for imports from South Asia in Pakistan. So this really negates the benefit of proximity, as Ambassador Saran has often said to us. What are intra-regional trade in South Asia is 30 percentage points or 15 percentage points more expensive than, for example, in ASEAN, and it is cheaper for India to trade with Brazil than for India to trade with Pakistan. So, and similarly, Bangladesh to Nepal versus Bangladesh to Brazil. So this is an unfortunate state of affairs. So the report went in depth. As I said, we analyzed new data, we talked to a lot of people, we did surveys, and we came up with some very interesting findings. We looked at 4 barriers: tariffs and para-tariffs, non-tariff barriers, costs of connectivity, and the broader trust deficits. So what did we, let's start with para-tariffs and tariffs. Now, import tariffs are a tax on imports, but economists know that they're also a tax on exports. And even if we don't include para-tariffs, which are basically tariffs in all but name, even without including para-tariffs, South Asian tariffs average tariffs are the highest in the world. And they're double that of, say, East Asia, and even more compared to other regions of the world. So there is already a significant barrier to trade for all countries, including with the neighbors. And then there are para-tariffs. That means these are non-transparent duties imposed on trade, which are not even reported to the WTO. And that actually, for countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, these are very pervasive. And for Bangladesh, actually, they double reported import duties if you include para-tariffs. And they are widely used in Sri Lanka as well as Pakistan. And these are not included in the South Asia Free Trade Agreement discussions, which of course, it's almost history the last time we had discussions on SAFTA. So these are not included, and therefore SAFTA actually almost became a non-starter to begin with. Apart from para-tariffs, we also have very long sensitive lists. Every country has hundreds of products where the duties, there are no concessionary duties. And overall, more than 1/3 of intra-regional trade was restricted under sensitive lists. Therefore, it's not really surprising that SAFTA does not work, and SAFTA is almost a non-starter to begin with. It's almost by design. And for example, if you look at India's exports, almost 40% of its exports to South Asia are restricted, and Bangladesh, 46% of its imports are restricted. So, and these examples are there across the region. The second second issue we looked at was non-tariff barriers, and we focused really, and this work was led by Taneja Vikriya, and we looked at non-tariff measures in bilateral trade between Bangladesh and India, and between India and Nepal, and we really did a very detailed survey on this, and we triangulated, consultations with regulators and looking at the data. And then we found that there is a big gap between perceived barriers and actual barriers. So a lot of what we traders find to be non-tariff barriers actually relating to information asymmetries. That means they don't really understand what are the rules and regulations on the other side of the barrier. And then when they come up against customs enforcers, they feel that it is a non-tariff barrier, but actually it is basically a lack of information about the rules and regulations on the other side of the border. And this is also lack of capacity on testing and being able to certify the standards that prevail on the other sides of the border. And then there are real barriers, which is border infrastructure, the very long customs clearance time. South Asia is notorious there. And then you have procedures which are, they take very long in South Asia. So this is all part of real non-tariff barriers. The third area we looked at was connectivity, which is perhaps, the area where there could be the biggest gains if these are improved, because these are really the nuts and bolts of international trade. We looked at one positive experience in South Asia. We looked at an example of India-Sri Lanka air connectivity, where we had, pre-COVID, we had 147 flights a week between India and Sri Lanka, as opposed to, say, only 10 flights a week between Sri Lanka and Pakistan, despite a free trade agreement in operation there. And these examples. So India-Sri Lanka was the sort of the stellar performer, 147 flights a week between Sri Lanka and 10 Indian cities. And obviously air travel is extremely important for goods and services trade. It impacts, everything impacts foreign investment. And we found that the gradual easing of linkages in air traffic between, thanks to bilateral air services agreements, actually led to, and we did some rigorous analysis in partnership with IPS of Sri Lanka here, that there were an increase of 16 flights per week as a result of the 2011 amendments in the BASA, the air service agreement, and more than almost 2,500 seats per week increased. And prices fell by 20 to 40% on the routes between India and Sri Lanka. Not only that, so the economic impact of this liberalization went beyond aviation. Since 2005, India has become the largest source of tourist arrivals in Sri Lanka. And also since 2003, there's been a steady growth in Sri Lankan tourist arrivals in India. So there has been a major impact on this. And of course, this was a positive impact of connectivity in the region. And there is much that is happening on the ground elsewhere in the region, especially on land borders between India, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, India, Bhutan. And we can come to that in the discussion. Now, the last area that we looked at was trust. And we sort of looked at it through the lens of an experiment called Border Hearts between, here we worked with CUTS and an institute in Bangladesh, which is led by Dr. Atiur Rahman, Unnayan Shamanmai. And the trust is a fragile commodity in South Asia. And the virtuous circle between trade and trust has been broken in South Asia. But the border hearts, which are basically weekly markets that operate between India and Bangladesh, they are helping to bridge this trust deficit, basically by promoting people-to-people interaction. They have had so trade really is a sideshow here. There has been a lot of increase in trust between India and Bangladesh as a result of these weekly markets that operate under regulated conditions. So welfare has improved a bit for vendors, for Bangladeshi vendors, for buyers on both sides between India and Bangladesh. But it has also improved the increase the lot on women. And there is a beautiful video on the web. Again, you'll find it on the World Bank website, on YouTube, led by Nikita Singla. This video was produced, and you will find more detail on that and how it has improved the lot of women. So people-to-people contact has improved. Daughter and women, for example, mother and daughter met after 13 year separation at the border hut in Srinagar in Tripura. I went there, and it was heartwarming to see the people-to-people interaction here at border huts. So as I said, trade is a sideshow, and it is strongly recommended that these border huts be increased, and they are in the process of happening on the India-Bangladesh border. So finally, I get to how do we get there? From these 4 barriers that we looked at, how do we get there? And of course, India, as the largest country in the region, 85% of the region's GDP and so on, India's leadership is critical to deepening the trade cooperation and reducing this huge trade deficit in the region, which prevails not merely between India, Pakistan, and between Pakistan and other countries, but between many other bilateral pairs in the region. But India has a big leadership responsibility here. And India has a big trade surplus, which was greater than $15 billion in 2015 with South Asia, despite the asymmetric liberalization where it has opened up its borders fully to South Asian LDCs. And of course, this, as economists know, this is a political issue rather than an economic issue, the issue of this trade surplus, but it is a political issue. And countries are worried about India's economic heft. So in a recent article in the Indian Express, I'd also raised the issue of how can India increase its imports from the region, which are only 0.6% of its imports overall, are imports from South Asia. And here we could, most important here would be exploiting the link between trade and investment. India's multinationals, which are huge in the rest of the world, must be encouraged to invest more in South Asia. And here there is a forthcoming trade report by the World Bank, which Ravi Yatawara and I are leading on investment pioneers. It will be coming out in the next few months. And we'll have occasion to talk more about that. But this investment will also encourage the development of regional value chains, which are largely missing in South Asia, despite the example of textiles and apparel. There are many examples of goods and services which are in very high demand from the rest of the region, and this can be multiplied. I'm sure my friends will have a lot more to say. There are Jamdani saris from Bangladesh, salwar suits from Pakistan, lingerie from Sri Lanka, Nepalese medicinal and aromatic plants, tourist destinations throughout the region, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, and their food imports in general. Now, what's the rest of the collective cooperation agenda in South Asia? Now, as I said, the connectivity agenda in the region has very high payoffs. So apart from air connectivity, where Afghanistan being landlocked can increase, should continue to increase air connectivity with India, with Central Asia, which will also link back to South Asia. Land connectivity between India, Pakistan, Northeast India, Bangladesh, rail and river connectivity, all of this is happening already, and I think this can be accelerated. The operationalization of the motor vehicles agreement between Bangladesh, India, and Nepal, I think it is time that the protocols for putting this in place be speeded up, and this actually starts off. Then addressing the problems arising from non-tariff measures. India should provide capacity support to meet these quality standards that it has, and as it is already doing in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Again, proactive asks from the neighbors of India to meeting its non-tariff measures. And then, of course, operationalizing, electronic data interchange, the randomized testing rather than, blanket testing of imports, single window clearances at more border points. Again, these are things that are happening. Again, good things are happening here, but much more needs to be happening here. And of course, liberalizing trade within South Asia, careful management of the winners and losers. This is again a collective agenda, reducing the para-tariffs, including them in SAFTA, and these tariffs and sensitive lists. Again, all of this needs to happen. Nothing has happened since 2015 here. And then finally, taking the initiatives of trust building through people-to-people contact, this border heart model, which has been very, very popular, as I said, in these 4 border areas and in the 10 kilometers surrounding the border areas. These need to be replicated on all land borders. Even we have said in the Kashmir, Kashmir border of India-Pakistan, the broader India-Pakistan border, on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. These are great experiment, deserves to be replicated everywhere where we have land borders. The Kartarpur religious tourism, which is still going ahead despite everything, such examples can be again be replicated on other borders. And there is, the Buddhist interchange, the Buddhist border, Buddhist tourism is already happening. Again, a lot of such cultural exchanges can happen. Medical tourism can happen between India and the rest of South Asia. So there is a big collective cooperation agenda. Now let me come to a little bit of the India-Pakistan agenda, and here I'm going to put myself out a little bit. There is a lack of economic cooperation, which is a very significant constraint to the rest of South Asia. Pakistan really suffers hugely here. Its trade with India, even pre-COVID, it was only $2 billion. It could be $37 billion, and Pakistan could have $18 billion of exports to India, which would be a massive share of its total exports pre-COVID. So what are the asks that I think we should have here? We should ask India and Pakistan to get on with. One is immediately go back to the pre-2019 trade regime. Wagah border is critical for Afghanistan. Allow Indian land exports via Wagah. India in return can allow Pakistan exports to Nepal and Bangladesh via land. Remove the 138 product rule at Wagah. India in response can reduce its own sensitive lists to 100 products or less. Currently it's 614 products. And here is a massive ask here for India and Pakistan. Can we actually begin work on a free trade agreement, dare I say it, between India and Pakistan? These are the only 3 non-LDCs in South Asia. 2 already have FTAs between them. India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Sri Lanka already have FTAs. From an economic point of view, can we not have an FTA? And I'm sure, we can debate this, but I'm really talking just purely from an economic point of view. Can we have an economic regime prevail even as we sort out the politics? So we can have a discussion on that. And what about the COVID? What about COVID in South Asia before and after COVID? Well, here are some thoughts. India is a major supplier of pharmaceuticals and PPE, protective equipment. Pakistan can supply medical textiles equipment. Priority recipients can include South Asian countries. Now, world trade volume, says the WTO, may decline by 13 to 32%. UNCTAD says 20%. South Asia has been hit as hard as anybody else. Can South Asian countries become better partners for each other and somewhat compensate? All earlier recommendations that I just made would be valid here. And can we have air bubbles for travel and medical tourism? Now the 4 smaller countries which have been much less hit by COVID can actually be in a good position to dictate on this. Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bhutan, and Nepal. They can choose which cities or geographies in South Asia they would like to have such exchange with these air bubbles, and that will kickstart activity for at least Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bhutan, and Nepal, and have this exchange of travel and medical tourism. And finally, why it matters. Why does all of this matter? Because trade, nobody can give up on trade, whatever the rhetoric you hear in the world. Trade has been important for global poverty reduction. When world poverty went down in 1990 from 1.9 billion in 1990 to 0.8 billion in 2013, trade to GDP went up from less than 40% to 60%. Women gained disproportionately from trade. Exporting firms have much more women in the workforce. They pay better, the quality of jobs is better. So in times of COVID, as in any other times, we cannot afford to neglect unused economic opportunities, where South Asia has more than, the unused opportunities are more than anywhere else. Finally, the road not taken. This road, the South Asia road, as those of us who work in South Asia know, that it's hard and long. That is how development happens. We cannot give up because people's welfare is at stake. As I said, there are strong economics between deeper regional trade. Behind the deeper regional trade, there are global headwinds, there are loss potential, there are huge costs to consumers and exporters. The small incremental steps will add up in the long run, and maybe 20 years from now, as in the famous poem by Robert Frost, people can then say, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dr. Kathuria. I won't try and summarize your presentation because it was already a very good summary of your book. But I will add that for those of you who have not yet had an opportunity to look at it, that the data that backs the conclusions that he has put out are very granular and are very vivid and very solid. And I think they put together, they make out a very solid case. And I think they bring out the irony of the fact that here is a region that is hydrologically, geographically, economically, historically, even culturally, and geopolitically one. And yet it has perhaps the least degree of integration, I think, that he graphically compared in terms of statistics with most of the other regions of the world. And the levels of regional trade, the levels of regional integration, the levels of investment, everything is far, far below potential. I would also like to flag that I think he's ended it with some very bold recommendations, particularly bold recommendations, on the India-Pakistan front, because I think he marked out the trust deficit as the single most important element, I think, hindering the process of integration. There is no doubt about it. I think there's no question about it. And also the opportunities in a way that are thrown up by the post-COVID situation. In a way, even when we talk about self-reliance, I mean, if we could think in terms of a kind of greater regional self-reliance, and this would certainly give a fillip to the South Asian regional cooperation idea. So I will save my remaining comments for the discussions. Our next panelist is Dr. Nagesh Kumar. He's the director and head of the South and Southwest Asia office of the UNESCAP, the UNESCAP based in Delhi. Earlier served as chief economist of UNESCAP at the UNESCAP headquarters in Bangkok. And before joining UNESCAP in 2009, he served as Director General of RIS for 7 years. He also served at the faculty of the United Nations University in Maastricht, Netherlands, and directed its research program on globalization, FDI, and technology transfers. Dr. Nagesh Kumar, the webinar is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. It's a privilege and a pleasure to join this very distinguished group. I want to begin by thanking CPR for this very timely interaction because as Sanjay said, the world trade is contracting by 30%. And what is better than realizing the unrealized potential of South Asia, which is sitting there, and we haven't tried to exploit that potential. And also, I want to begin by congratulating Sanjay for very comprehensive, very lucid presentation, and also welcoming you back to India. And I learned that you have just joined CPR's faculty. So welcome back, even though at this moment what I was saying is that, the finding of this World Bank study led by Sanjay actually corroborates the finding of a 2017 UNESCAP study, which is actually cited in the book, which also came up, even though with a slightly different methodology, to the same conclusion that we were losing 67% of the intra-regional trade potential in South Asia. So I feel very much heartened by your findings, and shows that these are robust results. And I would also like to point out that both World Bank study and UNESCAPs are done in a comparative static context. And if we were to go into a more dynamic setting, the estimation of trade, mutual trade, could be much larger. And this is, I think, very much, one example I like to always quote about the potential of trade liberalization in a regional setting is India-Sri Lanka trade, because that the two countries have a first modern bilateral free trade agreement, and what came out of that agreement could be a good pointer for any analysis on regional trade potential. And so this agreement, India-Sri Lanka one, although it was signed in 1998, it became functional from year 2000. And within 6-7 years of that, in fact, I had commissioned a study while I was at RIS to evaluate what happened. And even though it is a bit dated, but it's an interesting example. So the study found that in 6 or 7 years of its implementation, this agreement led to a 300% increase in trade. But that was not all. The remarkable thing of the agreement was that it led to a much more balanced expansion of trade between the two countries. We all know that India-Sri Lanka trade was very one-sided. There was a proportion of India's export to import of 10-1, and 6 years later it was narrowed down to 3-1. So trade expanded by 300%, and it expanded in a much more balanced manner, that the Sri Lanka was able to export more things to India. And so then we pushed this team to look at further what was happening. I mean, what are the new products that Sri Lanka was exporting that is what it was not able to export earlier. And the team came up with a finding that there were 1,000 or more products added to Sri Lanka's export basket, which were new and value-adding products. Never before Sri Lanka exported them to India. And then this was a very interesting question, how suddenly the productive capacity, which is a barrier for intra-regional trade, increased. And the answer we found was that most of these products were produced in Sri Lanka for exporting back to India by Indian firms or their joint ventures, to take advantage of availability of some raw materials at preferred prices or cheaper prices in Sri Lanka, such as natural rubber. So this is one example which shows that when this process of what is called as efficiency-seeking industrial restructuring is harnessed, then possibilities suddenly jump up. and they could give rise to much more balanced trade. And Sanjay was referring to earlier this one-sided nature of this trade. And I think the answer is allowing more investment, more mutual investment in creating supply capacities in the other countries than India, so that they can export back. And for that to happen, of course, you need liberalization of trade more than investment liberalization, because you need access to markets, in a very unhindered basis. So the supply chains or value chains begin to emerge, and they help to, bridge the deficits that are there and lead to a much more balanced expansion of trade. Sanjay has also pointed out, a lot of barriers, and the para-tariff barriers and NTBs, are obviously restricting this potential from happening, and also the trade costs. I think this is one thing which we found, that the trade costs, and Sanjay was referring to that, the example he gave was India, Pakistan, vis-a-vis India, Brazil. This is exactly what this database that has been developed by UNESCAP and World Bank together shows, that the intra-regional trade in South Asia has much higher cost of trade than the trade with North America or European Union, which means that we are effectively denying to intra-regional trade the benefits of geographical proximity. And that is a very unfortunate situation. And largely this is happening because of poor trade, transport connectivity and poor facilitation at the borders. One has to just go to any of those land custom stations of India at the borders. For instance, one at in Bangladesh border in Meghalaya at Dhaka, you see a 5 kilometer or 4 kilometer long queue of trucks waiting to be cleared by customs. And that means, the trade costs multiply several times. And it is no surprise that we are not able to exploit the potential of mutual trade, and this is, it continues to hold back. So what is the solution? I think, and some steps are being taken. Recently, India and Bangladesh started to move goods through container trains. And that's, I think, very important step. Container trains moving across the borders, containers sealed electronically, so that you don't have to open them at the borders, and they are tracked electronically. So they move across the borders and go to a point where they are unloaded and then moved to their final destinations through trucks. This is the kind of thing I think we need to replicate. India, Bangladesh are moving in that direction. India, Nepal have also moved to, there has been a container terminal in Birganj, and the Nepal's trade with India and rest of the world has been passing through that. But recently, this electronic tracking system was introduced, and that has brought costs of trade much lower. And so this is the kind of thing we need to replicate on all other corridors. But what is also important is to link these bilateral corridors into a sub-regional or regional corridor, because that will multiply their benefits in a very, very big manner. And we have been, for long advocating a corridor running across South Asia and linking up in Yangon with Southeast Asian corridors. And on the other side, beyond Pakistan, connecting them with, Islamic Republic of Iran and further down with Turkey. So there was a concept developed by UNESCAP of and ITI, the Istanbul, Tehran, Islamabad, which is already happening, is already functional corridor, linking it up or extending it to Delhi, Kolkata, Dhaka, and eventually to Yangon. So something like that, becoming not only a major artery for trade within South Asia, but also allowing South Asia to reap the benefit or harnessing its strategic location at the confluence of major corridors between South Asia, Central Asia, East Asia on the other side, and many countries which become or which emerge as hubs or transit locations could reap, running income or revenue from transit fees. So something like that is a big picture thing we need to work on, but how and when, that is an important issue. So the other thing we have also talked, in the report I was referring to, 2017 UNESCAP study, was, of course, for exploiting full potential of regional cooperation and the partnership, you need a very comprehensive approach, of which transport connectivity could be one element. The trade liberalization of the type Sanjay was talking about could be another element. Trade in services, there is a huge potential, although there is SATIS agreement, but it remains, dysfunctional or unfunctional, or, again, not able to exploit the potential because it remains only a framework and no work has been done on give and take in the liberalization of trade in services. So that, needs to be part of a comprehensive economic partnership. And investment, of course, is very important thing to tie it up with, and people-to-people exchange of the type Sanjay was talking about. So the trust deficit that Sanjay has talked about, I think, is something we need to look at how we can resolve that. And in that context, I think one very important, and this is my last point, Mr. Chairman, I saw your message. I'll conclude or wrap up in a minute. I think COVID, this pandemic, has many devastating effects on South Asian economies, but it has also brought together leaders of South Asia on a single platform to coordinate their actions. And they are, all talking about that, and they immediately set up a SAARC emergency fund. Recently, last month actually, UNESCAP, through this South Asia office, organized a high-level policy dialogue with ministers of economy and planning of South Asian countries. All of them talked in one voice of importance and criticality of regional cooperation in the new context. So I hope that this momentum, which is there now, can be harnessed to take the potential and to exploit the potential of regional cooperation, because everyone is concerned and every country is suffering from the loss on trade part with the rest of the world trade going down the way it is going down, and the potential or prospects of that recovering in near future are not really there. So I'll stop here and hope we can find some answers to some of these questions which are there before us. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Nagesh. I think some very, very important points. Thank you for bringing in your RIS report on India-Sri Lanka trade. I think what it showed is that in many trade liberalization, market access has also contributed to greater investments, diversification of the economic base, and all-round prosperity. So trade liberalization together with connectivity has also enhanced productivity. And I think you've also raised some very interesting points about the costs of trade, particularly seamless transport across borders, and a number of other points that you raised. But let me also end with the point that you made about the opportunity thrown up by COVID. And in this context, may I also flag that coming Tuesday, South Asia, that CPR itself is bringing out a report on the, on the possibilities of regional cooperation emanating from COVID and the potential that throws open in terms of regional cooperation. So I invite you all to look at that. This is a report co-authored by, led by Ambassador Shyam Saran, Sandeep Bhardwaj, as well as Nimi Kurian, joined by me. So this is that. Now, our next speaker, and I think it's very appropriate that I forgot to flag one more point. I think the rather visionary point that you made about connectivity, all the way from Istanbul to Southeast Asia. I think this has been talked about in the past. And in addition to the kind of connectivity projects that you mentioned, we could also talk about, Chabahar. We could also talk about the Lapis Lazuli route and a number of other east-west connectivity routes that have been coming up that connect to Eurasia on the one hand and to the Arabian Sea on the other. Next panelist, it's appropriate in many ways, Bangladesh has been very central to our discussion, is Dr. Selim Raihan, professor of at the Department of Economics at the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh, and executive director of the South Asian Network on Economic Modeling. He holds a PhD from the University of Manchester, UK, where he is currently the honorary senior research fellow and alumni of Harvard University's program on cutting edge of development thinking. It's published widely, 17 journal articles, 23 books, 35 chapters, and 45 working papers. We look forward to your insights on South Asia, trade, and regional cooperation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I also thank the organizers for inviting me. And my sincere thanks to Sanjay for this very valuable contribution to this literature on regional integration in South Asia. I actually take few points from Sanjay to elaborate, take a kind of perspective to use my time for to discuss on this issue. But I think as we have been talking about potential of regional integration or potential of gains from regional integration in South Asia, and there have been many studies in the past using gravity models, using CG models, some of which I also authored. I think that, as I mentioned, that Sanjay's this book, edited volume, and some of the chapters are very, very important contribution to this literature. But the point is that to make this potential a reality, because we all talk about the potentials, as you also rightly pointed out, Sanjay, in your presentation, that we need to do something to make this potential a reality. And I just listed 5 points. And I'm quite sure that these are also, these are reflected in your volume, as well as these are kind of our understanding of the challenge of regional integration South Asia. The first point is that we must have a full implementation or meaningful implementation of the FTA or SAFTA. Second is, we need to renegotiate about the sensitive list and the para-tariffs, as you very rightly mentioned, that these are the para-tariffs were not in the part of the discussion. So we need to renegotiate. And the high sensitive list, very long sensitive list, that need to cut down. And the third is that, as you also very rightly pointed out about these non-tariff measures or non-tariff barriers, and the way these are affecting South Asian trade. So here I just wanted to highlight 2 important studies which I actually led in the last 5 years through Asian Development Bank. One was the South Asian Economic Union, and another one is actually partially published, but it's coming up on 6 South Asian country studies on SPS and TBTs. Very rigorous, very detailed work on looking into these non-tariff issues and non-tariff measures. Here I also want to highlight that there is a SARSO, South Asian Regional Standard Organization, which has a head office in Dhaka. And the whole idea of having SARSO was to harmonize the standards. And that was, I would say, one of the biggest achievements of SARC is that it actually had an organization like SARSO. So despite that, we talk about a lot of failures, but there are some success stories, even within the SARC process. So my 4th point, you also rightly pointed out about the trade facilitation and the importance of the regional trade infrastructure and connectivity to reduce the trade cost. And my 5th point and my final point here is that, as you very rightly pointed out and also elaborated by Dr. Nagesh Kumar, that we have to go beyond trade in goods. The importance of trade in services and the importance of the trade investment nexus, how the interregional investment can also be a driver of interregional trade. I think that has to be looked at. So all these 5 things, I think that these need to be in order to get a kind of, to get the potential, to translate the potentials into reality. But here I'll want to highlight two areas that, in order to achieve these 5 important areas or points, we need to have significant development in 2 major areas. First, we need to have a long-lasting political agreement or commitment among the political elites of the 8 South Asian countries. And I just want to highlight or remind all that we economists, as economists, we can suggest many things, that these are the gains, these are the losses, but ultimately these are the political leaders who decide to join any regional trading arrangement or not. I just want to give an example of India's decision of BRI and RCEP, where India's bilateral relation with China, the political relation with China, in my understanding, affected India's decision whether joining RCEP or BRI. So I think these are very important that we also need to take into account. So here I just want to elaborate or kind of stretch Sanjay's trust deficit idea into more of a kind of political economy perspective. This is my first point, that we need a long-lasting political agreement. And the second, we need to reorganize the SAARC Secretariat, make it powerful, and we need to assign capable people there. So the existing SAARC Secretariat is not able to actually carry forward this new agenda. So these 2 points are very much at the heart of the political economy. So unless and until we have a better understanding of the political economy issues, I think we will miss out many of the challenges of what the South Asian countries are facing in terms of low integration. So now when we talk about this political commitment, my understanding is that political commitment, when we say that the countries need political commitment, it may sound as a kind of strong exogenous factor, that the political commitment is a kind of strong exogenous. But I think it's not a strong exogenous factor. It is also dependent on domestic politics, countries' development strategy, and also the kind of geopolitical factor, and also the kind of location where the country is standing. So I think all these things also influence the countries, the political elites, their political commitment. We also often blame our bureaucrats for slow progress in regional integration. That the bureaucrats, whether the political leaders, probably they are in agreement, but the bureaucrats, they have a kind of tendency to make it slow. But in my understanding, that unless and until the bureaucrats, they get a very clear and strong signals or messages from the political elites, actually they can't move ahead. So therefore, the slow integration or lack of integration in South Asia is not an economic problem, or is not even a bureaucratic problem. In my understanding, it's a very, very strong political economic problem. So that's the kind of idea I just want to stretch, and taking clue from your trust deficit, Sanjay. So therefore, when it comes to this political economy challenges, here I can see few issues. First is the size imbalance. And India occupies more than 70% of land population of GDP of South Asia. And if you compare South Asia with European Union and ASEAN, you don't see this kind of imbalance in many of the successful regional integration areas. That means, as Sanjay very nicely pointed out in one of your slides, that India has a much larger role to play as a leader. So that kind of leadership is extremely important from India, to make this regional integration agenda forward in South Asia. So, but as an outsider, as a non-Indian, how do I see India's role or leadership role? I see that it's a kind of inconsistent. Sometimes it's very, very active, very positive, and sometimes very, I would say that India is very eager to take this agenda forward. For example, India's unilateral decision to grant LDC or duty-free preference to LDCs in South Asia. I think it's a remarkable, just showcasing of leadership role. But in some other areas, we see the kind of, I would say, lethargic or lack of interest. So I think this is something extremely important, that we see that kind of leadership from India. So, but India's leadership role is also kind of affected by the domestic politics in India. So domestic politics in other South Asian countries are also very, very important. But here I think the domestic politics in India also affect the kind of whole integration, regional integration process. Then second point is the role of other South Asian countries. As I said, that the domestic politics in other South Asian countries are also extremely important. But at the same time, I think there is a fear, as Sanjay pointed out, there is a fear that there's a fear of Indian dominance. But the other South Asian countries, not many, they actually looked at the opportunities. That you have the largest market in this region, which is the Indian market. And how to tap the potentials of this larger market by exporting to this largest market. And I just want to highlight, and also not only exporting, but I think I don't really want to take this mercantilist approach. Also importing from India, it can also benefit your economy. The best example is Bangladesh. Bangladesh actually has shown how the country can import raw materials from India and use these raw materials in its major export sector, the ready-made garment sector. I think this is a remarkable success story, which many of the South Asian countries actually failed. Sanjay very rightly pointed out the case between the trade of India and Pakistan, where I think that probably Pakistan missed out the trade or the kind of opportunity. And the way Bangladesh showed that even importing from India can be extremely useful for your industrialization process. And so that's why, despite that, many South Asian countries, they have the fear of premature deindustrialization. When I look at the data, Bangladesh has been able so far to actually increase the value-added and employment share of manufacturing. So I think that is something, and in that case, the importing from India has helped Bangladesh in the industrialization process. So my next point is that unlike Southeast Asia, where we see a very deeper integration through ASEAN, I also see there that there is a kind of convergence of development strategies there. But in South Asia, we don't see that. The 8 South Asian countries probably moved into different directions when it comes to trade policy, when it comes to FDI policy, macro policies. So we need to have a kind of convergence. And here I agree with Dr. Nagesh Kumar. And I think this is something extremely important, that the SDGs have given us this opportunity. Since all these 8 South Asian countries, they have the commitment, the political commitment of implementing SDGs. And there is a high chance of aligning their development strategies to SDGs. So I think this is an extreme important opportunity, prime opportunity which the South Asian countries shouldn't miss. And also the COVID-19 situation, a crisis situation, is also giving an opportunity to work together. I don't want to highlight that part. Dr. Kumar and Dr. Sanjay Kathuria, they already elaborated that point, but I think this is also an opportunity. Another point, I'm just towards my end of my discussion. Another point which Sanjay did not touch, and neither Dr. Kumar, I think this is very sensitive, which is the China factor. China factor, I think this is something very sensitive, I know, but this is something we can't ignore. We know that India has a kind of reservation about China because of its bilateral political relation. But the other South Asian countries, how do they see China? Most of them, they see China as a kind of major trading partner, as well as a source of FDI. So I think there is a need for reconciliation of this China factor in the South Asian integration process. Otherwise, we'll be missing something. And we'll still have some gap in our understanding of each other. And how do we see the world? So I'm very much at the end. So finally, what we need. In my understanding, what we need, a very strong political settlement or agreement among the political elites in the South Asian countries. So when you talk about, not only in my understanding, the economic elites, the business elites, they are in kind of understanding. They can understand, they largely understand the need for regional integration. But the political elites, they are divided. So if there is a kind of mechanism which can bring these political elites into kind of agreement, that would really help. So in my understanding, this kind of consultation, dialogues, volumes or researches by glass half full, as Sanjay has done, and more interactions, and also promotion of political liberalism, I think that can be extremely helpful to get us together and get this kind of political settlement right. I will stop here. Over to you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Selim Raihan. I think you have caught not just one bull, but maybe more than one bull by the horns. I think you have flagged a point that has been recurring, this element of political will, political commitment, and political leadership, and particularly the role of the largest country in the area. But you have also gone beyond the India-Pakistan, the obstacles to greater South Asian regional cooperation by bringing in the other bull, which is the China factor. And you've also made some other very interesting points, amongst which I would say that this whole idea of a convergence of development strategies, the comparison with Southeast Asia, I think is a very important point. I think the information about the South Asian regional harmonization and standards organization in Dhaka, something that I didn't actually find mentioned in the report, but obviously that could play a very important role in this whole issue about information awareness and about standard setting and, you know, the kind of obstacles to trade that take place because of standards. And I won't summarize the rest, but again, I think they're very good discussion points. And in fact, to follow, particularly given all the political issues that you have raised and brought to a kind of, you know, flagged and highlighted, I think we are actually very fortunate that we have the right person to be able to address this, Ambassador Shyam Saran, senior fellow at the CPR and member of its board, former foreign secretary, former special envoy of the Prime Minister for Nuclear Affairs and National Security Board, and chairman of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries. He is currently also, as I mentioned, in the governing board of the CPR, life trustee of the Indian International Center, a trustee for the World Wildlife Fund, and a member of the national executive of FICCI, showing his sort of wide range of interests, a very prolific writer, a major public intellectual, and perhaps the best place to, I think, flag all the points that have been raised essentially by, you know, by economists, by scholars, and by more technical contributors to this process. And I think we can raise this to a political and diplomatic level with Ambassador Shyam Saran. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gautam. And let me begin by complimenting Sanjay for the very fine study that he has led on South Asian trade and economic integration. And as has been pointed about by other panelists, we see that there is a huge potential. There is need for a lot of ambition. But at the end of the day, as our distinguished colleague from Bangladesh pointed out, it's all about politics. So I think it's been study after study which has tried to persuade you know, leaders in South Asia that they are missing out on what is perhaps a very big opportunity, I would say, for the region, which is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. But somehow we have not been able to get to that. So politics is at the heart of, you know, why we have not been able to actually realize this potential. So let me begin by trying to, you know, head on address that issue. So it has been pointed out that we have, you know, the problem of asymmetry in the region, the fact that the sheer size of India does create anxieties about domination amongst our smaller neighbors. There is also, by the way, on the Indian side, there has been for a long time almost a sense of siege with respect to smaller neighbors around us. A constant fear that, you know, there may be a ganging up of the smaller neighbors which might erode India's interests. And somehow India has to protect itself. So as I have tried to point out again and again, that we look upon our borders not as connectors, but we look upon our borders as walls behind which we must, you know, try and protect ourselves. So this is a mindset issue. We need to be able to get over this issue. Look at, in fact, borders as connectors, as I said. Look at borders as enabling transmission belts of development across borders. The other aspect is when we are talking about, you know, connectivity and we are talking about trade facilitation, why is it that when we see that there are examples in Southeast Asia, examples in Europe, examples in even in Africa, where connectivity has been embraced, why is it that there is still a inhibition in terms of, you know, bringing about that connectivity so that we are able to exploit the one big asset which we have, which other trading partners do not have, which is proximity. It is only through connectivity that you can have proximity. Why does it not happen? Because again, when you have that kind of a mindset of being under siege or being threatened from across your borders, then of course the security overlay becomes something which overrides, all the various arguments for closer connectivity, for greater flow of goods, of peoples, of even ideas across borders. So how do we address that security overlay? That has become a major challenge. That it is not by saying the security consideration is irrelevant or is exaggerated, but I think what are the ways in which we can address those security considerations? And Nagesh pointed out how, the use of containers, the use of, electronic tracking methods. These are ways in which we can convince the security establishment in our countries that actually that security, consideration can actually be addressed by using modern technology. We are still very far away from that, and then to be honest, there is a resistance to that. For example, when I was in Nepal, I tried very, very hard to have these, electronic fixed scanners, installed at the borders, so that you could have, a much freer flow of, these container trucks and, goods, cargo trucks across the border. Because with the scanners and with very sophisticated software, you could do just a few, trial inspections, but let most of the traffic move across the borders. But there was a tremendous amount of resistance to that from those who were manning the borders. There are reasons why that is the case. But unless there is a very strong political push, it is difficult to overcome that kind of resistance. So this is something that we need to look at. Now, even if we are looking at the security aspect, Gautam, you have been ambassador to Myanmar, as I have been. And, when I was in Myanmar, we were involved in the construction of the famous, Tamukale highway. So there used to be quite a lot of, materials which had to be transported from across India into Myanmar. So in connection with that, I used to go and sometimes spend time, sometimes incommunicado, at the border. And I became aware of the fact that even though we had a border agreement which limited trade to something like 60 items on both sides, this was a border across which massive amount of contraband was moving every day. You are saying contraband, but it is not really in that sense contraband, because there is a huge demand for those goods. Chinese synthetic blankets, you had plastic molded furniture, you had, footwear, furniture, of different kinds, having actually a negative impact on the northeast of India. But, I could not get across to our government the argument that how does it make a difference if a Chinese product is coming through the border from Myanmar? Why don't you treat it in the same manner with MFN as you do at the port in Calcutta? The government of India is missing out on a huge amount of, revenue. There is a kind of a criminalization of trade which is taking place at the border, and the whole argument about, security then completely goes out of the window. So all the things which you are doing because you are concerned about security, actually you end up by undermining security much more than would have otherwise been the case if you actually allowed the border trading point to be one for regular trade even. So there are the issues of this kind and I'm speaking mainly from the point of view of India, because I think unless India takes the lead, it is very difficult to change the kind of situation which we are talking about. So this security overlay must be met head on, because it is actually, instead of enhancing our security, it is actually eroding our security. I would be very interested in your view, because you have also seen that same kind of issue, perhaps during your time in Myanmar. The other aspect that I want to point to is that, we are talking about, is there a political commitment? Is there a political buy-in? Please look at multiple SAARC declarations at the summit level, where if you were only to go by the language of those declarations, you would think that the South Asia is the most economically integrated region in the world. Now, many people do not know that actually 2010 to 2020, which is now coming to an end, is actually the SAARC decade for multimodal transport connectivity. So, and the leaders have signed on to this. It is not at a bureaucratic level. How much progress have been able to make in terms of transport connectivity during the last decade? Some progress, yes, but certainly the kind of ambition that the leaders have been trying to demonstrate, it is certainly not happening on the ground. And it is not that, oh, the leaders are ready, but the bureaucrats are not. That is simply not the case. The leaders find it very easy to sign on to these declarations with no intention of actually addressing the kind of political considerations, the security considerations that others have talked about as well. So we have to confront that. And here I would like to end with something that we have tried to do. I am part of what is known as Champions process for South. I think Sanjay has been also very much involved with that. So I'm sure that he will corroborate what I'm saying. So what we started doing was getting a group of people from the South Asian countries, people like me, but others also from, let's say, from Bangladesh. We have had Professor Gohar Rizvi, former High Commissioner to India, Ambassador Tariq Karim. We have had a couple of, former foreign secretaries from Pakistan. We have had a former secretary for power from Nepal. So we have had a group of people who have actually been in the public space, in the policy making space. So they are aware of why things which are accepted at the political level, why do they not get implemented at the ground level? So the idea was to have very, very open and frank conversations about what are the psychological barriers, what are the political barriers, which is preventing South Asian countries from moving ahead with what is quite patently in the interest of all our countries, in the interest of the people of South Asia. And what we came up with was, okay, these are the barriers. We can't, sort of head on try to remove these barriers. So what we started doing was what we called a process of nibbling away. You sort of keep eroding this kind of barrier slowly, but always keeping the big picture in mind. The second aspect was, once you have that big picture, break it down into smaller components, because it is our view that governments in South Asia, but even large organizations everywhere, find it very difficult to swallow big projects in one go, no matter how compelling they are, because there is a nervousness about what the political implications may be, a fear that if it does not work, then we will be held responsible for some failure. So it is, even though there is a political commitment, it is difficult to find actually practical progress on the ground. So what we started doing was we want to do the restoration of river transportation between India and Bangladesh, or some kind of a power trading arrangement between India and Bangladesh, but perhaps Bhutan or Nepal into this process. Is there something that we can do? So what we did was we broke these bigger, projects to small components. Once you have even a modest advance, that sets up these kind of a stage for further advance. And this is precisely what has happened. That we have today, making a modest start from this process of Champions process, we identified river transportation as something that we could take forward. We began very modestly, okay, 1 or 2 river ports, but provide, the kind of infrastructure which is required, the kind of, procedures required for movement. 1 work, 2 work, and then, it opened up for a considerable amount of, passage, in fact, to our northeastern states through Bangladesh. And Bangladesh, earns transit fees from that. Much bigger, much more dramatic development as far as the power trade between India and Bangladesh is concerned. We started off with 5 megawatts, a target of something like 5,000 megawatts, 6,000 megawatts. So, and we have been able to bring in, because when Bhutan sees, oh, there is a big potential here, Nepal sees there is a big potential here, they also want to be a part of this exercise. So this was another way of trying to overcome some of those barriers. So I would suggest that, the very compelling case for regional trade and investment and collaboration, which has been made in this study, and also in the UNESCAP study that Nagesh do. From Bangladesh also mentioned that there are several studies in this respect. Perhaps there is a way in which taking these political realities and psychological realities into account, we start, these years slowly through more modest, measures to begin with, and slowly start expanding them. I think this is a practical way of taking this forward. But don't be fooled by the fact that there is a rhetorical commitment, which is very, very ambitious. As I said, I did a study of the successive SARC summit declarations. And let me tell you that if you really go through that, you would believe that South Asian leaders are really some of the most visionary when it comes to regional cooperation. But it is that is not the case on the ground. So politics is the problem. And I think without addressing this politics, we will not be able to get very far. And on the China question, I would say that precisely because China is making greater inroads into our neighborhood, all India should really, try to fast track its own integration with its as something which should really stay on the part of India to really South Asian neighborhood. India should become the transit country of choice for all its neighbors. India should be able to open up its economy, its market, to whatever our neighbors are able to sell to us. It is a small fraction of the Indian market. Even if you actually were to buy everything which your neighbors wanted to sell to you, it would be a drop in the ocean as far as the India is concerned. Here is an advantage for you. Use that asset. That is the way in which you can meet the China challenge. You have the advantage of proximity, again, vis-a-vis China. Use that proximity in order to be able to, be the engine of growth for the entire region. If we can do that, then I think even in terms of the politics that we are talking about, we should be able to address that. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And once again, I think you've reinforced the point that has been made that politics is at the heart of everything. Sorry? Yeah, am I audible? Yeah, okay. So thank you, sir, for reinforcing the point that has been made, which is that politics is at the heart of everything that we do. And also, if I can join that with Professor Selim's observation that domestic politics also has a say. And I think you ended by giving a very, very good justification for regional cooperation based on politics. Precisely the proximity that we have with our region and whatever it is, the strategic competition that we have with China. That strategic competition with China is, in fact, could be a major driver for regional integration, particularly in our own region, South Asia region. And I hope that message gets across. I think also, thank you for pulling out that other skeleton in the cupboard that we had not raised so far, which is how the security issue in many ways dampens or inhibits our regional cooperation. Also this issue that even when we've had the political will, as manifested in our SAARC declarations, that there have been implementation issues down the line. And perhaps that one way of approaching it is through, breaking down the big picture into smaller, more achievable components. And we have seen actually a combination of all this. I think leadership is very, very important. And we have seen a combination of this in actually working its way in our relations with Bangladesh. I think gradually a lot of the inhibitions to transit are bit by bit breaking down. You also mentioned Myanmar. I think that's another story. I won't go into it because in the interest of discussion. We have a question from the audience, and that question relates to regional value chains, the growth of regional value chains. I think the question from Julie Bowman is whether there are good examples of the growth of regional value chains in South Asia, and in what products or in what sectors that is. But let me also add a kind of more general question to that. And I think, anybody who wants to speak on either of these questions could. Clearly, in Dr. Kathuria's analysis, what we have seen is there are 3 levels of barriers. He mentioned 4 barriers, but in a way, they can be categorized into trade inefficiencies, where simply there are implementation inefficiencies, information inefficiencies, various kinds of inefficiencies, simply because the system is not good, or if the regime that we have is not being implemented well. The second is the issue of measures, policy measures, which in one way or the other go around to a question of protectionism, where interests or lobbies in one particular area may actually inhibit trade liberalization and therefore hold the whole region hostage to more restrictive trade practices. And of course, the third one is at the political level. Ambassador Shyam Saran also raised this whole point that, perhaps there is a need for an eminent persons group in all countries who can, flag the middle distance between the technical inputs that we have and the political leadership that we have at that level, to be able to mobilize and galvanize a kind of political support behind the idea of greater regionalism, open regionalism, as Dr. Kathuria has flagged. So on these points, on the point of on the point of perhaps the need for a body of public intellectuals who can play a much more positive advocacy role to be able to promote greater open regionalism. Secondly, this whole issue of vested interest. How important is that in being able to prevent our greater regional integration? And thirdly, how can we address these trade inefficiencies, which are very much to do with the implementation of already agreed issues at the ground level? Maybe, Dr. Kathuria, I could begin with you as the lead author of this flagship report. And you could take both Julie's question as well as the points that I've raised. And of course, we would welcome any further questions from our audience.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And thank you to all the panelists, Nagesh, Selim, and Ambassador Saran for their very thoughtful comments. Julie's question, sorry?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and so on Julie's question of the regional value chains, and I think the potential, what is a bit frustrating is that the potential is so much more than what is happening. As Selim mentioned, there is a value chain happened in garments where Bangladesh uses inputs from India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, and managerial inputs also from these countries, apart from textiles and yarn and fabric. And so there is a thriving apparel industry in South Asia, but Bangladesh is really the heart of that. So that's one value chain. Again, even there, a lot more could happen. But there are so many other sectors where value chains could come up if there was, the sine qua non for value chains is that you need to have very fast in and out transport, which simply it doesn't exist in South Asia. Goods need to come in duty free, speed to their destination factory, and then speed out again. And so you need connectivity and zero tariffs for that. No, so there are regimes, but these are very cumbersome, as you also said, Gautam. And there are some other sectors where this could be possible. Is, for example, this could be in medical equipment, where we could have in rubber products. There is a large, between Sri Lanka and India. There could be a tourism. Why just in goods? There could be a tourism value chain. There could be a medical tourism value chain, which in another report of ours, Priya Mathur has a chapter on the Northeast where she talks about medical tourism and promoting a value chain there. So there are many possibilities, but I think we need to solve the basic trade issues there on connectivity and tariffs for this to really get off the ground. So I think Ambassador Mukhopadhyaya's issues on, I agree very much with what Ambassador Saran had said about the advocacy within countries. So to complement the work of the broader champion, the cross-border champions network. In fact, this was in a sense part of the intention of that champions network, which I was a part of from its inception for many years. But the sort of the within country part didn't have enough momentum, didn't take off. But I think that in order to, it didn't take off in a systematic way. Obviously, champions there within countries, like there is like Selim himself within Bangladesh. But this hasn't really, taken off in a way that we would have liked, in a systemic way. And surely there are vested interests on protection, right? So here I want to look at my experience, cite my example both in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, right? So 3 times in the Nawaz Sharif administration, 3 times we were very close to signing off on the MFN, the most favored nation clause, or treating India the same way as Pakistan treats other trading partners. 3 times this was close to signing, and each time something came in the way. But the most fundamental part of it was, one was a political miscalculation, but the most important one was really, as you said, is the fear of different lobbies that they would get swamped by Indian automobiles, pharmaceuticals, agriculture. At different points of time, these came to the fore. And I think when I was working in Sri Lanka, and I think, they have also been thinking of expanding the agreement with India from a free trade agreement to a deeper agreement, economic and technology cooperation agreement, or Sri Lanka signed an FTA with Singapore, which became more controversial after it was signed. But the point is that free trade agreements can handle political economy. by design. They can backload liberalization in sensitive sectors. And that was, for example, that's exactly what the India-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement did. Actually, it has backloaded very significantly Sri Lanka's liberalization and that's what happened also in the Pakistan-China Free Trade Agreement. So the less powerful economic neighbors or free trade partners can be accommodated. And I think it is, at the end of the day, it does require a sign-off.
I'm afraid I think it's frozen, the screen, the sound.
Is everybody else hearing me?
No, it's okay here.
Okay.
Ambassador, it might be on your end. The problem might be on your end.
No, both the sound and the video is frozen.
So it's audible and visible to the rest of us. So it looks as though.
Okay, you just go ahead.
You're back, sir.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that, so I think there is a way. Obviously, there are political concerns, and especially in today's day and age, when we've had all the backlash against liberalization, we have to be very sensitive to that. But there is a way. I mean, the world is now very experienced with handling free trade agreements. And there is a way to take into account the concerns in a very, and India has done that in some sense by opening up its market to LDCs, as Selim said. Completely open market to all the LDCs in South Asia, well ahead of that reciprocal liberalization at some time in the future, as SAFTA, undefined by SAFTA, in fact, when that would happen. So it is possible to do it. And I think the systemic inefficiencies, which Ambassador Mukhopadhaya mentioned, I think those are all too apparent. Most of them are not by design, I think, but maybe sometimes, especially at customs and all, partly some of those may be by design, but most of it, actually, these sort of non-tariff barriers, if you like, in implementation or broader implementation inefficiencies in all the agreements that have been reached are simply, lack of the capacity and the desire to push through something. And in that context, what Ambassador Saran mentioned, the breaking down of the big projects, some of it, which we have tried to do also in the report, really going an incremental way. But I think we can take this on board and try to break down all recommendations that way, and keep the big picture in mind, but then really parse the. I think those will be very, very important. So I think, and I agree with all the other comments that my fellow panelists have made. So I don't really, in the interest of time and giving others a chance, I will stop.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to also comment on any of the questions?
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, Dr. Selim.
Yes. I just wanted to highlight on that regional value chain. I think it's extremely important, and Sanjay has elaborated on that. And the example is, of course, a success example case is the ready-made garments. But there are many products, well, actually there have been many studies as well on the potential of regional value chain. I know Dr. Kumar and from UNESCAP, from UNCTAD, they have done quite a lot of studies. So how do we take this into account, and how we can actually translate the recommendations in those studies and then take those things agenda forward? I see a real game changer can be use of the special economic zones. Countries like Bangladesh has really come up with the idea of special economic zone very, very strongly. And this is a very strong policy agenda now in Bangladesh. And there are 2 dedicated special economic zone for India, actually for Indian investment. So I can see that kind of economic zone, and I know that Nepal is also interested, Sri Lanka, they have also economic zones. So this can be a kind of game changer if there is a more proactive role from Indian investors. I know a lot of Indian investors, they actually invest outside of this region, not in this region. But we need to have a better understanding why they are not willing to invest in this region. So, what are the problems? We know the problems on the trade side, but on the investment side also, there are many rules and regulations, regulatory barriers in those host countries. So if a very broad discussion and a very meaningful discussion can really take place, And Dr. Kumar, I know he can take a very strong initiative, being the kind of head of South and Southwest region UNESCAP in Delhi. I think that can be very, very useful. How do you really streamline the rules and regulations, how we can make the special economic zone effective, and how we can actually have more inter-regional investment around this regional value chain? I think that will be extremely useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nagesh, yes, you'd like to say a few words? Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. I think every point that has been made is very, very interesting and very useful. I agree that government sector has been one of the sectors where regional value chains have really come up. And Selim's point about special economic zones playing a role in that and facilitating this regional value chain formation is very important, because domestic tariff areas in every single South Asian country continue to remain very, very protected. And I think in garments, a very interesting example of Brandix, a major garment manufacturer of Sri Lanka, coming and establishing a major factory in the special economic zone in India, in Visakhapatnam, is a shining example of value chains being facilitated by special economic zones. I think this is the kind of examples we need to replicate and talk about. The other thing is, I think the point about policy advocacy is very well made. And Ambassador, you also highlighted that importance of policy advocacy. But one point which I thought is very important in this policy advocacy, because one often hears that trade liberalization, regional trade liberalization or SAFTA is a project to design the, project to enhance the dominance of India in the region, which is already there. And so every country has a deficit with India, and this will lead to more of a deficit. So this is the refrain, common refrain you hear from the policymakers in all the South Asian countries. But the very empirical basis of all different FTAs, and I refer to in my remarks of the India-Sri Lanka FTA, is, and Selim's work through CG models has always come up with one single finding, that trade liberalization in FTAs benefits smaller countries more than the larger countries. And that is the evidence we need to highlight, that this will help the smaller countries which do not have supply capacities to export to the larger markets. The FTA or SAFTA will facilitate creation of supply capacities in the smaller countries, lesser developed economies, for exporting back to the larger economies. And the evidence is uniform all across these regional groupings. In Europe, where after the integration, Portugal, Greece, Spain, became major hubs for German manufacturing. So Volkswagen cars, are assembled more in Spain than in Germany, So ASEAN is a very similar example. So lesser developed economies rise and catch up with the more developed economies. I think this is the point which needs to be also, emphasized in the policy advocacy when we try to support and put the evidence on the table. This is the kind of evidence we need to put on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nagesh. In fact, I think we are actually running out of time. I would have liked to have probed a couple of points, one of which is also flagged in the chat box. One is, the scope for agricultural trade and agricultural investment liberalization, given that a good part of the people of the region, derive their livelihood from land and water, from agriculture, fisheries, animal husbandry. And, what would be the kind of constraints or restraints in being able to open that? A second point that I would have liked to pursue is Dr. Selim Raihan's point about whether it's possible to bring about a kind of policy dialogue, perhaps by institutions such as ours and RIS and various others, which is on this whole issue of a development convergence, because I think there is a problem there. That, you know, we do not have a clear and coherent idea of what kind of development model we want to follow. You know, that is much less in many of the other parts of the world. So I think these were 2 points that I would have liked to follow. But from the audience there is, and I think we just have about 2-3 minutes to get over this. One is a kind of observation really about precisely this point that I made about connectivity and agriculture and freer trade. But another point, which if I can interpret rightly, it's about the domestic narrative of the present leadership in India being domineering, and perhaps, and you know, what kind of impact it has on regional trade. I suppose the question is whether a kind of, you know, muscular policies of India today, or at least the muscular rhetoric, might be scaring away some of our neighbors. If I understood Mr. Birendra Kumar Sinha's question right, and Mr. Sumesh Mathur's sort of general observation, I will just leave it for a quick round, perhaps at this time beginning with Ambassador Saran, in case he would like to address either of these two issues. Is Ambassador Saran there, or have we lost him? Because I don't see him.
I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah. Great.
I'm here.
Right.
Okay. No, I would agree that you know, whatever is the political rhetoric domestically does have an impact on regional cooperation and bilateral cooperation. Some of the statements coming out from, for example, from the Home Minister about immigration, illegal immigration from Bangladesh into India, or certainly the very heightened polemic with respect to Pakistan, or perhaps even some errors or omission with respect to our relations with Nepal. You know, all these do impact on regional cooperation. But on the other side, I would say that this government has also been very, very enthusiastic about what has been the neighborhood first policy. So if neighborhood first policy is something that enjoys consensus from even different political dispensations in the past, that's a very good thing. That there is a recognition that India can really not expect to play a credible regional role, a credible global role, unless it gets its neighborhood right. So that is a good basis on which some of the things that we are talking about, we can actually try to push. So, okay, if you really believe in neighborhood first policy, then these are the sort of things that we need to do. I'm afraid that unfortunately in the trade field, the overall trend seems to be towards more economic autarky rather than looking at, you know, how do we really use trade as a lever for really bringing about much higher rates of growth. But here I would agree that some kind of policy dialogue would be very useful, and in that sense, whatever we are trying to do, say with the Center for Policy Research, and I hope we can you know, revive a network of, you know, think tanks which can really look at that kind of policy dialogue amongst the South Asian countries. But I would also say that maybe the point made by Professor Selim, that, you know, the SDGs actually provide a very good platform to start talking on these matters, because I have also the you know, fear that if we start talking about policy dialogue and how we should try to bring about some convergence in our economic strategies, somebody will get up on his hind legs and see, this is yet another effort on the part of India to try and dominate even our economic strategies. So perhaps not to go in that direction, but to really look at what are the kind of platforms which can provide the basis for that kind of dialogue. But the other one is, for example, which suggests itself is ecology. climate change, because all of us are going to be very, very much impacted by that. So there are ways in which we can actually have the kind of a dialogue which can, without appearing to do so, does bring about that kind of at least a minimal level of convergence, so that we can take this project ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I think we are, I'm afraid we are really running out of time now. So before I end, I think I have to give our lead author and our principal, so to say, speaker today, the last words on anything that he would like to conclude with or add to the discussion. Dr. Kathuria.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you to everybody for great discussion. Well, just 2 or 3 points I want to make. So one is a point of information, and then I add on to that. As I mentioned earlier, that we are in the process. In the next few months, there will be a new flagship report from the World Bank on investment, regional investment pioneers in South Asia, I'm a co-author of that along with Ravi Yatawara. So we will be presenting this soon. And so hopefully we can have a discussion around some of the issues raised there, because I think really the private sector is at the heart of regional integration at the end of the day, that they are the ones who are implementers and executors. So even in these forums, we need to bring them front and center of that whole process. Now, my one plea has been, for the last few years, more and more forcefully I've been making that, is that, yes, we have all this issue of the politics, yes. But, we have examples of actually, the reversing so here saying that politics is obviously constraining trade or more broadly economic integration or economic exchange. But there are very good examples of that actually trade and economic exchange not being constrained by politics. And the best example that I can think of, there are many others, but Taiwan and China, right? Indeed, India, China itself, there is maybe a change in the rhetoric in the last few months, even much more now. But basically, China was among India's top 2 trade partners, despite obviously huge amount of suspicion and mistrust there. So I think that, and I'm pleading, and South Asia comes from a much better place in many bilateral relations there. So can we not have trade? And again, bearing in mind Ambassador Saran's stricture that, okay, let's not threaten anybody. So let's parse it down. Yes, we want trade to lead. Can we sort of say, okay, let's start with the really small wins, right? And I have said that to when I met the Commerce Minister of Pakistan during this book's dissemination, said, why don't you just have a discussion amongst the standards bodies of the 2 countries, non-threatening, nobody can object to it, right? So let's see what is holding up your exports from both sides. Have a technical, very, very technical discussion, right? And he very much liked that idea. So I think these kinds of issues, letting trade, not allowing trade to get bogged down, but continuing to push. And the final point I want to make is reiterate what I think everybody has said. All three of my fellow panelists have said that. Is the market in India is massive. So how can we, and that was also the subject of my recent Indian Express piece about how can India import more from the region. But there's a massive market. Can we use that as a hook, for greater economy? You got a massive market. In good times, India was importing $400 billion worth of goods. Can India, can Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, all of South Asian countries, can they really be used as a tantalizing hook? And Finance Minister Mohit, when we released the book in Bangladesh, he actually said so much, and says we are exporting to Europe and America, but we forget the huge market right on our doorstep that we have really not exploited. So I think that's the hook, and I think use that, small steps and all. Thank you so much to everybody, and back to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Sanjay. And I think we can end on that note. We talked about politics trumping economics, but you've ended with economics trumping politics. And I hope that message goes out as a political message as well as a larger business message. I think the role of business in being able to do that is also, coming into focus. So, we've actually quite substantially exceeded our time. We were expected to finish at about 7:45. I presume that this means that this has been a very successful and, lively discussion. I'd like to thank, first of all, Dr. Kathuria for presenting us the conclusions of his study and the book on the glass half full on South Asian regional trade. And I would very much like to thank our very, very distinguished panelists, starting with Ambassador Shyam, Saran, Dr. Nagesh, Kumar, and Dr. Selim Raihan, for being present and for gracing this webinar, as also sharing their considerable insights and wisdom in all these areas. I hope this is not the end, and I hope this is the starting point of a further dialogue. I'm sure we'll be open to suggestions for how to take this further. And of course, having Dr. Kathuria in the CPR should be a very big catalyst in being able to do that. Thank you very much. And for anything else, we'll have to conduct the discussion offline. Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Gautam.
Thank you, sir. Good day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
All the best.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.